Kim Yoo Jung was never just another young actress growing up in public. By the time she became a woman, the public had already spent years loving her as something softer than stardom and more intimate than fame. She was not simply known, she was remembered. Her face carried the kind of familiarity most celebrities spend an entire career chasing, because audiences had not merely watched her perform, they had watched her grow. And that is what makes her image so deceptively powerful now. Even in adulthood, even with more polished roles, sharper styling, and a calmer, more controlled presence, Kim Yoo Jung still carries the emotional shadow of the girl people once trusted without question. She stands in front of the camera as a grown woman, but part of the audience still looks at her through memory. That is where the tension begins. Because the real burden in Kim Yoo Jung's story was never fame itself. It was the cost of growing up inside the public's affection. People love child stars for what they represent: innocence, warmth, emotional safety, a version of softness untouched by complication. But that love can become possessive without ever looking cruel. The audience does not realize that what they call affection can slowly become pressure. They want the child to mature beautifully, but not too suddenly. They want the girl to become a woman, but not in a way that disturbs the version of her they already keep in memory. And for a star like Kim Yoo Jung, whose image was built on familiarity rather than shock, that pressure is even heavier. She was never supposed to collapse in scandal. She was supposed to remain emotionally recognizable forever. So the real story of Kim Yoo Jung is not just about a child actress who successfully stayed famous. It is about what happens when a girl the public once loved for being gentle, pure, and easy to hold in memory has to step beyond that image and become someone more complex. Because the most fragile part of Kim Yoo Jung's career was never her talent. It was the fantasy surrounding it, the fantasy that a beloved child could grow older without forcing the public to confront the fact that she no longer belongs to their nostalgia alone. Before Kim Yoo Jung became the kind of actress people spoke about with affection already built in, she was a child entering an industry too early to understand what it would eventually ask from her. She did not arrive at fame after adolescence, with a formed identity and a clear line between private self and public image. She entered while that identity was still being built. That difference matters. For Kim Yoo Jung, the camera was not simply a tool she learned to face later in life. It was part of the environment in which she grew up. She began in modeling and advertisements when she was still very young, then moved into acting so early that audiences did not watch her emerge in the usual way. They watched her develop. Her childhood was never fully hidden from public memory, because public memory was there almost from the beginning. That meant her growth was never just personal. It was always being recorded, interpreted, and quietly claimed by the people watching. That early rise also shaped the exact kind of love she received. Kim Yoo Jung became valuable not just because she was cute or talented, but because she seemed to carry something emotionally reassuring on screen. She was the kind of child actress audiences trusted to bring warmth, sincerity, and emotional clarity to a role. Again and again, she appeared as the younger version of heroines, the emotional anchor of family dramas, or the face that made a story's innocence believable. Over time, this gave her something far more powerful than simple recognition. It gave her familiarity. She was not only known, she was accepted. That is why the title, Nation's Little Sister, fit so naturally around her. It described more than popularity. It described a collective feeling that she belonged inside the emotional landscape of the audience. She was not just working in public. She was being absorbed into the public's idea of tenderness, trust, and continuity. But that is also where the burden first began, even if no one could name it yet. When a child is loved so deeply for being gentle, bright, and emotionally safe, that love can harden into expectation. The public does not just admire the talent, they begin protecting the image that talent arrived in. And for Kim Yoo Jung, that meant the gift and the trap were born at the same moment. The same innocence that opened every door around her also built the first wall she would later have to climb over. Because the longer people loved her as a child they could trust, the harder it would become for them to separate the woman she might grow into from the girl they had already decided to keep in memory. Long before the actual struggle of transition began, the conditions for it were already there. Her career did not simply start early. It started in a way that made the audience feel entitled to grow attached to who she had been before she ever had the chance to become someone else. For a long time, Kim Yoo Jung's talent had been undeniable, but it existed inside a category that could still make people underestimate what came next. She was admired, trusted, and widely loved, yet much of that love had been built around her ability to strengthen other people's stories. She was the younger self, the emotional foundation, the child whose presence made a drama feel more sincere. That kind of success is powerful, but it is also limiting. At some point, every child actor faces the same quiet test. Can the audience stop seeing them as a memory and start seeing them as the center? For Kim Yoo Jung, that transition mattered more than any single casting announcement. It was the moment her career had to prove that longevity was not the same as evolution. She did not just need another successful project. She needed a role that would force the public to look at her differently, not as a child star who survived, but as a leading actress who had arrived. That shift became real with Love in the Moonlight, 2016. As Hong Ra-on, Kim Yoo Jung stepped into a role bright enough, popular enough, and emotionally resonant enough to reintroduce her at the exact scale she needed. The drama did more than succeed. It gave audiences a new way to hold her image. She was no longer simply the girl they had watched grow up. She was now the romantic center of a major hit, carrying charm, vulnerability, wit, and presence in a way that made her feel undeniably like a leading lady. And that mattered because transitions like this are rarely clean for former child stars. The public often resists them. They may praise the actress while still withholding full acceptance from the woman she is becoming. But Love in the Moonlight gave Kim Yoo Jung a bridge between those two identities. She could still feel soft, familiar, and emotionally accessible, yet now that softness belonged to a heroine, not a child. Later works like 20th Century Girl, 2022, as Na Bo-ra and My Demon, 2023-2024, as Do He continued that process, widening her image from youthful nostalgia into something more deliberate, more poised, and more adult. But this rise came with its own hidden cost. The more successfully Kim Yoo Jung crossed into leading roles, the more a new kind of fantasy began forming around her. She was no longer only the nation's child star. She was becoming a symbol of graceful transition, the rare actress who seemed to grow up beautifully without losing the emotional trust people had placed in her from the beginning. That made her rise especially appealing, but it also created a new trap. She was not simply admired for talent. She was being turned into an ideal version of how a child star should mature, elegant, gentle, unthreatening, and seamless. In other words, her evolution was being loved most when it looked easy. And that is where the burden quietly returned. Because when the public begins treating your transition like a fantasy, they become less prepared for the reality of how fragile, uneven, and exhausting that transition may actually be. Kim Yoo Jung had finally crossed into a new phase of stardom, but in doing so, she had also entered a more complicated kind of visibility, one where success no longer freed her from the old image, but simply taught that image how to grow with her. The pressure in Kim Yoo Jung's story did not arrive as scandal, disgrace, or one explosive public mistake. It came in a form that is harder to dramatize but often more painful to live through. The pressure of growing up under a love that had already decided who you were. Kim Yoo Jung had been adored for so long as a child actress that the public did not simply support her career. They invested in the idea of her. She represented innocence and emotional safety. That is why her transition into adulthood was never going to be simple. For an ordinary person, growing older is private. For a child star, it becomes a public test. The audience that once loved your softness now waits to see whether you can keep it without seeming childish, mature without seeming unfamiliar, and change without breaking the memory they formed around you. In that kind of environment, pressure feels like atmosphere. It lives inside every new role, every visual shift, every pause, every performance that asks the public to stop seeing the child and accept the woman. And with Kim Yoo Jung, that burden was especially sharp because her image had never been built on rebellion or unpredictability. It had been built on trust. So the moment her growth became visible, the question was whether the public was ready to let her become someone they had never needed her to be before. That weight became more fragile when interruption entered the story. In 2018, Kim Yoo Jung temporarily halted activities because of health issues related to hypothyroidism. And that detail matters because it broke the illusion that her transition into adulthood would unfold like a perfect line. Until then, there was still a fantasy available to the public, that she would continue maturing beautifully, moving from beloved child actress to elegant leading lady without rupture or exhaustion. But illness interrupts fantasy. It reminds the audience that behind the image they have been watching since childhood is a real person with limits and a body that can refuse the pace the industry expects. For Kim Yoo Jung, this was not a scandal that stained her name. It was something quieter and sadder. It exposed how little room there is in the public imagination for a child star to grow unevenly. Even a pause caused by health can feel symbolically heavy when a career has been built on continuity. She was no longer just carrying the usual pressure of being watched. She was now carrying the deeper burden of interruption, of having her forward motion broken where the industry most rewards momentum. And because she had spent so many years appearing reliable and bright, that interruption did not only affect scheduling, it altered how the public followed her life. That is why the deepest tension in Kim Yoo Jung's career was never about being forgiven for something she had done wrong. It was about being granted the right to evolve without being pulled backward by memory. After returning, every mature role carried more than performance. It carried negotiation. She had to inhabit adulthood while knowing that part of the audience would always compare the woman on screen to the child they had already loved too completely. That is what makes her story more haunting than dramatic. She was not fighting to erase a scandal. She was fighting for permission to become more complex than the image that first made people feel safe. And that may be the hardest transition of all, because it asks the public to surrender something they rarely want to lose, the illusion that the child they remember can remain emotionally available to them forever. Kim Yoo Jung's burden was not guilt, but expectation. Not collapse, but interruption. Not scandal, but the strain of trying to grow into a fuller self while being watched by people attached to the simpler version of you. And yet, what makes Kim Yoo Jung's story endure is that she did not stay trapped inside the image that first made the public love her. She carried it forward, but she also outgrew it. That is what makes her present-day image so compelling. She is still familiar, still emotionally recognizable, still able to awaken the same softness audiences once felt toward her as a child. But that familiarity no longer belongs to innocence alone. It now exists beside restraint, control, and a much more deliberate kind of presence. By the time Kim Yoo Jung reached projects like 20th Century Girl, My Demon, and especially Dear Ex, 2025, she no longer felt like a former child star trying to protect an old image. She felt like an actress finally learning how to use that old image as contrast. In Dear Ex, she plays Baek Ah-jin, a top actress whose beauty, charm, and public elegance hide a far darker, more manipulative interior. The role itself is important because it proves something the public has been slow to fully accept for years. Kim Yoo Jung is no longer just someone who can carry tenderness. She can carry danger too. That is why Dear Ex works so well as the payoff to her arc. It is not just that the role is darker, it is that the darkness directly challenges the fantasy people built around her for so long. Baek Ah-jin is not soft in the way the public once expected Kim Yoo Jung to be soft. She is controlled, wounded, strategic, and at times unsettling. And that makes the performance more significant than a simple image change. It becomes proof of acting range. Reviews singled Kim Yoo Jung out as the defining force of the series, with praise centering on how she balanced emotional restraint with sudden outbursts, and how she made Baek Ah-jin evoke both pity and horror at the same time. That response matters because it confirms that her transition is no longer only visual, it is dramatic, it is artistic. She is not just wearing maturity like styling, she is performing complexity at a level strong enough to carry a psychological thriller built around a deeply fractured woman. In other words, Dear Ex does not simply show that Kim Yoo Jung has grown up. It shows that her acting has grown darker, sharper, and more dangerous without losing emotional precision. So the final legacy of Kim Yoo Jung may not be that she was a child star who successfully survived adulthood. That is too small for what her story became. Her real legacy is that she survived one of the hardest transitions in public life, becoming a woman while the public was still emotionally attached to her as a girl. And in the end, she did not overcome that burden by destroying the old image completely. She overcame it by deepening it, bending it, and finally proving that the softness people remembered was never the whole truth of her talent. Dear Ex makes that visible in the clearest possible way. It gives her a role where charm becomes camouflage, beauty becomes threat, and composure becomes a weapon. That is why her story lands with more ache than triumph. The child the public once adored is still visible in her face, in her familiarity, in the instinctive affection she still inspires. But she is no longer contained by that memory. What remains now is something fuller and far more interesting, A woman who grew up under public affection, survived interruption, and emerged as an actress capable not only of being loved, but of unsettling the audience that once thought they already knew her.